For 7 years, the Matthews family's German Shepherd had never once shown aggression toward anyone. That changed the moment their new elderly neighbor moved in next door. Max wouldn't approach him, refused treats from his hand, and growled whenever the man came near. The family was baffled by this uncharacteristic behavior, until the day their neighbor collapsed during a neighborhood barbecue, revealing a truth that would leave an entire community speechless. Hello, dear friends. It means the world to me that you've joined me today. I'd be so grateful if you could share in the comments where you're listening from right now. Whether you're in a bustling city apartment, a quiet country home, or somewhere in between, knowing we're connected across different places makes these stories so much more special to share. I read every comment and truly treasure this community we've built together. Now, let's discover why this loyal German Shepherd recognized something no one else could see. The Maple Creek subdivision in Charlotte, North Carolina, was exactly what Sarah and Tom Matthews had been looking for: friendly neighbors, good schools, and streets safe enough for their 10-year-old twins, Emma and Aiden, to ride bikes. Their 2-story colonial on Sycamore Lane had everything they wanted, including a fenced backyard for Max, their 7-year-old German Shepherd who had been part of the family since he was a puppy. Max was known throughout the neighborhood for his gentle disposition. He greeted the mail carrier with a wagging tail, played patiently with visiting children, and even tolerated the Siamese cat next door who occasionally wandered into their yard. His calm, friendly nature was so reliable that Sarah often joked he'd make a terrible guard dog. He'd likely welcome burglars with a tennis ball, hoping for a game of fetch. In the 3 years since moving to Maple Creek, the Matthews family had become fixtures in the community. Tom coached Little League, Sarah volunteered at the library, and the twins had a bustling social life that kept the house filled with the cheerful chaos of playdates and sleepovers. Through it all, Max remained the steady, loving presence that completed their family portrait. When the for sale sign went up at the Johnsons' house next door, there was neighborhood-wide speculation about who might move in. The Johnsons had been in their 70s, quiet but friendly, the kind of neighbors who kept to themselves but always remembered birthdays with cards and small gifts. "I hope it's a family with kids," Emma said over dinner one evening, twirling spaghetti around her fork. "As long as they're not the type to mow their lawn at 7 a.m. on Saturdays," Tom added with a smile. The moving van arrived on a Tuesday in April. From their kitchen window, Sarah watched as a single older man directed the movers. He appeared to be in his late 70s or early 80s, with a slight stoop to his shoulders but an alertness to his movements that suggested someone used to give orders. "Looks like we have another retiree," she reported to Tom. Later that evening, Sarah packaged up a homemade lasagna and walked next door with Max trotting beside her, his leash loose between them. It was their welcoming ritual, good food and friendly faces to ease the transition for new neighbors. The man who answered the door introduced himself as Frank Pearson, recently retired from a career in engineering and relocated from Boston to be closer to his daughter in Raleigh. He had kind eyes and a firm handshake, thanking Sarah warmly for the lasagna. But something strange happened as they stood talking on the porch. Max, typically eager to meet new people, hung back. His ears flattened slightly, and he maintained an unusual distance from Frank, positioning himself partially behind Sarah's legs. "Your dog seems a bit shy," Frank observed, extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of canine greeting. Max didn't move forward. If anything, he inched back further. "That's odd," Sarah said, glancing down at Max with a puzzled expression. "He's normally very friendly. Maybe he's just tired from all the excitement of someone moving in." Frank nodded understandingly. "No worries. Dogs have their ways of sizing people up, don't they?" Sarah agreed, though as they said their goodbyes and headed home she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. In 7 years, she had never seen Max behave that way around anyone. "Maybe the guy smells like cats," Tom suggested later that night, "or he uses some cologne that Max doesn't like." Sarah nodded, but remained unconvinced. Max's reaction hadn't seemed like simple dislike or discomfort. It almost looked like recognition. Over the next few weeks, Frank proved to be an ideal neighbor, quiet, respectful, and quick with a wave or friendly hello when their paths crossed. He kept his lawn immaculate, never had loud visitors, and even brought in the Matthews' empty trash cans one day when they were away. But Max's behavior didn't improve. If anything, it intensified. When Frank would approach their shared property line to chat, Max would position himself between the man and the family, particularly the children. He never barked or lunged, but a low, almost imperceptible growl would rumble in his chest when Frank came too close. Have any of you ever experienced a pet acting strangely around someone for seemingly no reason? Animals have such incredible instincts, don't they? If you're finding this story intriguing so far, I'd appreciate it if you could tap that like button. It helps more people discover these remarkable, real-life stories. Now, let's continue as things take an unexpected turn. After a month of this puzzling behavior, Sarah finally raised the subject with Frank directly. They were both collecting their mail one afternoon when Max once again positioned himself protectively between them. "I'm so sorry about Max," she said, embarrassed. "I can't explain it. He's never been like this with anyone before." Frank looked at Max thoughtfully, a strange expression crossing his face. "May I ask where you got him?" "He was a rescue," Sarah explained. "We adopted him when he was about a year old. The shelter didn't know much about his background, just that he was found wandering near a highway in Tennessee." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Max. "Tennessee, you said?" "Yes, outside of Nashville, I think. Why do you ask?" Frank hesitated, then shook his head. "No reason, just curious. Some dogs take time to warm up to strangers, especially if they've had a rough start in life." As May turned to June, the neighborhood began its summer ritual of weekend barbecues and backyard gatherings. The Matthews hosted the first one of the season, inviting several families from the block, including Frank, who accepted with warm enthusiasm. The afternoon was perfect, sunny but not too hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of grilling burgers and the sound of children's laughter from the makeshift badminton court Tom had set up. Max, as usual, made the rounds of familiar guests, receiving pats and sneaked treats from indulgent neighbors. Frank arrived carrying a homemade apple pie and a bottle of wine. As he entered the backyard, Max immediately went on alert, his eyes tracking the older man's movements from a distance. "Still not a fan, I see," Frank said good-naturedly to Sarah as he handed her the pie. Sarah sighed. "I don't understand it. He's usually such a good judge of character." "Maybe he's right about me," Frank joked with a wink. The party continued pleasantly, with neighbors catching up after the long winter and sharing plans for summer vacations. Frank, despite being new to the community, fit in seamlessly, charming everyone with stories of his engineering days and amusing anecdotes about adjusting to Southern living after decades in New England. About 2 hours into the gathering, Frank was mid-conversation with Tom when he suddenly stopped speaking, a strange expression crossing his face. He reached for the back of a nearby chair, his knuckles whitening as he gripped it. "Are you all right?" Tom asked, noticing the change. Frank didn't answer. His face had gone ashen, and a thin sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. "I think I need to sit," he began, but didn't finish the sentence. His knees buckled, and he began to collapse. Tom reacted instantly, catching the older man before he hit the ground. "Sarah, call 911, he shouted, carefully lowering Frank onto the patio. Neighbors rushed over as Sarah grabbed her phone. Frank's eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing labored. Then, something extraordinary happened. Max, who had been keeping his distance all afternoon, suddenly approached. Instead of showing the wariness he'd displayed for weeks, he whined softly and nudged Frank's hand with his nose. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he lay down beside the fallen man, pressing his body close as if offering comfort or warmth. "What's he doing?" Emma whispered to her mother as they waited anxiously for the ambulance. Sarah shook her head, bewildered. "I have no idea." The paramedics arrived within minutes, quickly assessing Frank's condition. "Looks like a cardiac event," one of them said, attaching monitoring equipment. "Has he mentioned any heart problems?" "We don't know him well," Tom explained. "He just moved in next door about a month ago." As they prepared to transport Frank to the hospital, the dog's strange behavior continued. Max followed the stretcher to the ambulance, whining anxiously when they loaded Frank inside. "We'll look after him," Sarah promised, though she had no idea why Max had suddenly become so concerned about a man he'd seemed to distrust just moments earlier. With the party effectively over, neighbors dispersed with promises to check in later for updates on Frank's condition. The Matthews family spent a subdued evening, all of them puzzled by the day's events, especially Max's dramatic change in behavior. "It's like he knew something was wrong with Frank," Aiden said as they cleared away the remnants of the barbecue. "Maybe he did," Tom mused. "Dogs can sense things sometimes. Changes in body chemistry, subtle behaviors we might miss." But why was he so wary of Frank before today? Sarah wondered aloud, and then suddenly protective when Frank collapsed. The hospital called the next morning. Tom had left their number as a contact since the paramedics couldn't reach Frank's daughter immediately. "Mr. Pearson is stable and asking for you," the nurse explained. "All of you. He specifically mentioned your dog." Puzzled but relieved that Frank was recovering, the Matthews family arranged to visit that afternoon. After some discussion and a call to confirm it would be allowed, they brought Max along, curious about what Frank wanted to say. When they entered the hospital room, Frank was sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. His face brightened when he saw them, especially when Max walked in on his leash. "There he is," Frank said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Cooper." The family exchanged confused glances. "His name is Max," Emma corrected gently. Frank smiled, tears suddenly welling in his eyes. "Not to me. I called him Cooper, short for Copper Penny, because of that unusual copper-colored patch on his right hip." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications of his words sank in. "Are you saying," Sarah began slowly, "that Max was your dog?" Frank nodded, extending a trembling hand toward Max, who, to everyone's amazement, immediately approached the bed and pressed his muzzle into the older man's palm. "5 years ago, I was living outside Nashville," Frank explained, gently scratching behind Max's ears in a way that made the dog's eyes close in contentment. "My wife had just passed, and Cooper, Max, was my only companion. One night, there was a terrible storm. The thunder spooked him, and he bolted through a gap in the fence. I searched for weeks, put up posters, called every shelter, drove through neighborhoods calling his name." His voice broke. "I never found him. Eventually, I had to accept that he was gone forever. After a year of rattling around in that empty house with all its memories, I decided to move closer to my daughter. I never imagined." Max had jumped up, his front paws on the edge of the hospital bed, nuzzling Frank's face as the older man wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. "But if he recognized you," Tom said, "why was he so standoffish these past few weeks?" Frank wiped tears from his eyes. "I've been thinking about that. I look and smell different now. After my wife died, I grew this beard, started using different aftershave, and the heart medication I'm on probably changes my scent too." The cardiologist had explained that Frank had a previously undiagnosed heart condition. Yesterday's episode had been a warning sign, uncomfortable but not immediately life-threatening. "Maybe he wasn't sure at first," Frank continued, "just something familiar that he couldn't quite place. But yesterday, when I was in distress, my body probably released chemicals, stress hormones, that triggered his memory completely." Sarah remembered something the rescue organization had told them, that Max had been found along Interstate 40, the main highway running east from Nashville. He'd been wearing a collar but no tags, unusual for a well-cared-for dog. "The tags must have come off during his travels," Frank said when she mentioned this. "He was microchipped, but it was an older chip. Maybe it stopped working or wasn't detected." As the Matthews family watched Max, or Cooper, reuniting with his first owner, a complex mix of emotions washed over them. Joy at witnessing such an extraordinary reunion, anxiety about what it might mean for their family, and amazement at the circumstances that had brought them all together. "What happens now?" Aiden asked the question everyone was thinking. Frank looked at the boy, then at Max, and finally at Tom and Sarah. "I would never dream of taking him away from his family," he said gently. "He's yours now, has been for years. I'm just grateful to know he found good people who love him." Relief flooded through the family, though Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for the elderly man who had lost so much. "But," she said, deciding at that moment, maybe we can work something out. Max, Cooper, clearly remembers you, and we're neighbors, after all." Over the following weeks, as Frank recovered from his health scare, a new routine developed. Max divided his time between both homes, spending days with the Matthews family but often trotting next door in the evenings to curl up beside Frank's chair as the older man read or watched television. The neighborhood marveled at the story, which soon spread beyond Maple Creek. A local news station did a feature on the unlikely reunion, which was picked up by national outlets. Animal behaviorists contacted the family, fascinated by Max's ability to recognize his former owner after so many years and changes. But for the Matthews family and Frank, the miraculous nature of their situation needed no scientific explanation. They had witnessed something profound, a recognition that transcended time and circumstance, a bond that even years of separation couldn't break. Frank's daughter eventually relocated to Charlotte to be closer to her father after his health scare, moving into a house just a few blocks away. She often joked that her father had gained not just a dog but an entire extended family in his new neighborhood. "I thought I was moving here to be closer to my daughter," Frank said at a neighborhood gathering 6 months later. "I never imagined I was following a trail that would lead me back to an old friend, and to new ones." Max, comfortable in his role as a bridge between two families who had become one, simply wagged his tail, secure in the knowledge that sometimes life's most extraordinary circles do find a way to close. As we come to the end of this remarkable story of reunion and recognition, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing this time with me. Stories like this remind us that there are connections in this world that defy simple explanations, bonds of loyalty and love that persist against all odds. If this story touched your heart today, I would be so grateful if you could take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support means everything and helps these stories reach others who might need a reminder that extraordinary moments of connection can happen when we least expect them. I would truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an animal recognize someone from their past? Or perhaps you've experienced an unlikely reunion in your own life. Every comment means the world to me, and I read each one with gratitude for this amazing community. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to sharing another story with you soon. Until then, perhaps take a moment to appreciate the special bonds in your own life, whether with pets, family, or friends. Sometimes the most meaningful connections are the ones that find their way back to us, even when we thought they were lost forever.